The winter of 1974 had settled over the small New England town like a heavy quilt stitched together with frost and stillness. Streets that just weeks before had been choked with the noise of school buses and hammering carpenters now lay silent beneath a patient blanket of snow. The night sky was clear, stars scattered above like shards of glass reflecting a cold, distant light. Each house along Ashford Lane glowed faintly through frosted windows, their amber warmth spilling across driveways lined with neat mounds of shoveled powder. It was Christmas Eve, and in this town Christmas was sacred, not in the garish, overlit commercial way you saw in the cities, but in something softer, something older. People still baked pies from scratch. They still brought wood inside in the crook of their arms, shaking off the cold before stepping through the front door. It was a place where neighbors knew the smell of each other's kitchens, and every snowstorm seemed to draw the town closer rather than shut it in. On the corner of the street stood the Henderson house, white clapboard, green shutters, a roofline that looked like it had been drawn by a childhood read too many fairy tales. The Hendersons were to many the heart of this little stretch of Ashford Lane. Thomas Henderson, the father, a broad-shouldered man with gentle eyes, worked at the town's bank, though no one could quite remember the last time they saw him actually behind the counter. His wife, Mary, was the type of woman who made introductions for you when you walked into a room, as if she'd been waiting for the day you met. And then there were the children, and 12, the quiet one, Peter, 9, with the hair that would never stay down, and little Sophie, barely 6, with a laugh so sudden and high that it startled even herself. That night their home seemed to hum with warmth. The smell of cinnamon roasted meat and pine wafted through the air, carried by faint drafts between the kitchen and the living room. Outside, if you stood still, you could hear music, faint but unmistakable, drifting from their radio. Bing Crosby, always Bing Crosby this time of year. If you asked the neighbors what they remembered most about that night, they would almost always start with the same thing: the light. The Hendersons had strung their Christmas lights differently than the others, not the sharp, twinkling white strands the newer families preferred, but fat, old-fashioned bulbs that glowed in colors too rich to be bought today: deep blues, molten reds, and golds that seemed to belong to another decade. Against the snow, they didn't so much shine as they did bleed color into the night, casting faint halos into the drifts that lined the porch steps. It was the kind of scene that in another story might have been captured on a postcard, one of those images strangers pin to their refrigerators without knowing who lives inside. But this story does not end like a postcard. It ends with questions, and it begins herein. This false security. By 7 o'clock the street had grown quieter still. The Hendersons' neighbors across the way, the Bells, had drawn their curtains. The Postwicks down the block were gathered around their own table, exchanging gifts. A night early in the Henderson home, laughter rose and fell in waves, punctuated by the sharp tink of cutlery against porcelain. Somewhere upstairs, Anna's record player skipped and started again, filling the second floor with muffled guitar chords. Sophie's footsteps pounded the hallway above her, voice carrying down the stairs in quick bursts of excitement. Inside that house, everything seemed simple. Outside, the air was still enough that you could hear snowflakes land. The whole town, all 3,000 souls, seemed suspended in a shared moment of peace. And yet, if you could pull the lens back far enough beyond the twinkling bulbs and warm kitchens, you might notice something strange about that particular corner of Ashford Lane. You might notice the upstairs window across the street, the one without any light, and the faint outline of a man seated there, unmoving, watching. But no one noticed then, or if they did, they said nothing. Years later, when people spoke about the Henderson family, they almost always began with a contradiction. They were happy, someone would say, and then in the next breath, but you could tell something was different that year. A hesitation, a slight distance in Thomas' eyes at church. Mary, pausing too long before answering simple questions. These were details no one connected at the time, threads too fine to weave into any pattern. In hindsight, they became impossible to ignore. For now, though, there was only the hum of dinner conversation, the glow of those antique bulbs, and the first distant chime of the town's clock tower striking the hour. Snow continued to fall, soft and patient, erasing the day's footprints one by one. If you had stood at the edge of their driveway just then, you might have seen Thomas rise from his chair to pour another glass of wine. You might have caught the sound of Sophie's chair scraping against the floor as she wriggled away from the table, laughing at something Peter whispered. You might even have thought about how nice it all seemed, how untouched by the rest of the world. And if you had any sense of what would happen in less than an hour, you would have stayed there, rooted to the spot, memorizing every detail. Because sometimes the most haunting thing about a disappearance is not the absence that follows, it's the knowledge that Someone somewhere was the last to see it all intact in the years since Ashford Lane has had many winters. The houses have changed hands, the children grown and gone. But ask anyone old enough to remember that particular Christmas Eve, and they'll tell you they can still see the lights from the Henderson house in their minds, still hear that faint music floating through the snow, and somewhere in that memory, just before it turns dark, they feel it, the same quiet unease, the same inexplicable shiver, as though the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to arrive or to take. It wasn't unusual for the Hendersons to have people over. They were that kind of family, the kind who always set one more plate just in case. But Christmas Eve was different. Most households in Ashford Lane kept to themselves that night, reserving it for family tradition and the quiet rituals passed down through generations, which is why when Thomas and Mary extended their invitation, no one expected them to do it widely. Just two guests were named: the Fosters from 3 doors down and Arthur Bell. The Fosters were an easy choice, close friends, frequent visitors, their children often tangled in the same backyard games as the Henderson kids. But Arthur, that was something else entirely. Arthur Bell had lived across from the Hendersons for 7 years. In all that time, most of the town had only exchanged a handful of words with him. He was a man carved from silence, tall, gaunt, his posture permanently stooped, as though the air around him carried a private weight. He walked to the market twice a week. Always the same route, eyes on the ground, his gloved hands clasped tightly behind his back. Some whispered he was a widower, others swore they'd seen him boarding a train out of Boston once years ago with a uniform in his hand. No one knew for sure, but what everyone did know was that Arthur did not come to dinners, not for the 4th of July cookouts, not for the church socials, not even when the mayor himself invited him to the Veterans Hall banquet in '72. So when Mary Henderson told the post office clerk she was setting a place for Arthur this year, the words spread down Ashford Lane like a quiet ripple. Mary never explained why, she only said it seemed right this year. It seemed right. And because she was Mary, no one pressed her further. On the day itself, the house was already warm. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen breathed heat into the hallway's steam curling off the windows. Mary moved between the stove and the counter with a practiced rhythm, brushing flour from her hands, checking on the roast, straightening the folds of a cloth napkin as though the smallest details mattered most. Thomas, apron tied clumsily over his shirt, took charge of the drinks, humming under his breath. The children darted in and out like restless sparrows. Sophie, trying to sneak candied pecans from a bowl. Peter, arranging little army men in marching formation along the living room windowsill and disappearing with her book to the quiet corner under the staircase. By 6:30, the Fosters arrived, boots stamped at the threshold, cheeks pink from the cold. Laughter swelled as coats were hung. Greetings exchanged. Conversation took on that gentle, overlapping hum of people who know each other well enough to skip small talk. And then at precisely 644, the sound of a single knock at the door cut through the noise. It was not the quick double tap of a friend or the hurried rapping of a late arrival. It was slow, deliberate. When Thomas opened the door, the winter air rushed in, and there stood Arthur Bell, a long wool coat buttoned to the throat, black gloves, his hair silver and perfectly combed, caught the porch light in faint streaks. He held nothing, no gift, no dish, just a small nod and a quiet "Merry Christmas." If the Fosters were surprised, they didn't show it. Mary ushered him in with a warmth that seemed to melt the awkwardness instantly. She helped him out of his coat, hung it neatly by the door, and gestured toward the table. Arthur took the chair nearest the window, his back to the dark street outside. From that position, the world beyond the glass seemed to dissolve, replaced by the soft glow of the room. Conversation moved carefully around him, at first like dancers adjusting to a new partner. Arthur spoke little, but he listened, really listened, the way people do when they're paying attention to more than just words. His eyes lingered on faces, gestures, even pauses between sentences. When Mary placed the first dish before him, roasted duck with crisp skin, its scent mingling with cloves and rosemary, Arthur's thin smile deepened. "Haven't had this in years," he murmured. The remark carried weight, as though he wasn't referring only to the food. Somewhere between the salad and the carving of the duck, the tension began to dissolve. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then stronger. Arthur answered a question from Peter about the old camera. He was known for carrying still works, he said softly. Used it this morning, in fact. He glanced toward the window then, just for a second, before focusing again on his played outside. Snow thickened, muting the sound of passing cars. The world beyond those walls faded further into the kind of quiet that makes rooms feel more intimate. In photographs taken earlier that week, now yellowed and tucked away in boxes, the Henderson dining room appears like a still from an old film. Plates arranged in perfect symmetry, glasses catching the light. The family and their guests caught mid-laughter. At the time, no one would have thought anything strange about the scene if there was an undercurrent, a shift in the air that night. It went unnoticed, buried beneath the warmth of the moment. But looking back, every detail feels heavier. The deliberate way Arthur chose his seat, the way his eyes seemed to track the corners of the room when no one was speaking, and the curious fact that when Mary poured the first round of wine, Arthur declined, saying, "Only I like to keep my head clear." No one asked why not then. They were just glad he was there, because in a town like Ashford Lane, a Christmas dinner with all the chairs filled was something to be grateful for. And sometimes gratitude makes you blind. From the outside, Arthur Bell's house didn't look much different from the others on Ashford Lane. White siding, a narrow porch, the kind of place you might imagine holding the same warmth as the Henderson home across the street. But it wasn't warmth that filled Arthur's rooms. If you'd stepped inside that night, you would have found the air colder than you'd expect. For December, curtains drawn tight, furniture placed with exact precision as though the layout were measured for efficiency, not comfort. No smells of roasting meat or cinnamon, only the faint scent of dust and old paper. Arthur lived alone, and though no one in town knew much about him, there was one habit they couldn't help but notice. Arthur filmed things, not events, not family gatherings, not even the kinds of moments people usually preserve. He filmed streets at odd hours, mail being delivered, children walking home from school, the surface of the frozen pond at midnight. Neighbors called it eccentric, some whispered other words. The camera, black 8mm Bell Howell, was always ready, always clean, and always loaded. It was an older model, the kind with a satisfying mechanical hum when the motor ran. Arthur had owned it for years, treating it less like a hobby and more like an extension of himself. If he wasn't holding it, it sat on the tripod in the upstairs front room, pointed through a narrow gap in the curtain at the street below. That upstairs room, Arthur's watch post, gave him an unbroken view of the Hendersons' front door, their dining room window, and the path leading down to the mailbox. He could have stood there for hours without being noticed. He often did. When asked years later why he spent so much time looking out that window, Arthur would simply say, "The street changes when people think no one's watching." On Christmas Eve 1974, Arthur had no intention of attending the Hendersons' dinner. When the invitation came, he wasn't the kind of man who crossed thresholds easily, but something he could never explain what made him say yes. Perhaps it was the memory of his own childhood Christmases, or perhaps it was simply curiosity. Still, old habits don't dissolve in one night. Before dressing for dinner, had done what he always did, set up his camera. It was just after 5 p.m. when the tripod legs clicked into place against the wooden floor. Arthur angled the lens toward the Hendersons' porch, framing the shot to include both the front door and the window that looked into their dining room. The machine whirred softly as he checked the reel. The image in the viewfinder was faint in the fading light, the whites of the snow already blooming brighter than the shadows. He told himself it was harmless, a record of the street, he would later say, but the truth was simpler. Arthur liked knowing he could rewind a night and watch it unfold again. Where other people trusted memory, he trusted film. At 600, he stopped the motor and stepped away. The camera sat quietly in the dark, aimed in, waiting. Arthur's walk across the street that evening was the first time most of his neighbors had seen him outside without his camera in hand. He looked smaller in the glow of the Hendersons' porch light, his long coat hanging loose at the shoulders from the upstairs window of his own home, the camera silent. I watched him go inside the Hendersons' house. He tried, and for the most part succeeded, to blend in, but there were moments, subtle ones, when the pull of that upstairs window seemed to tug at him. His gaze would drift to the frosted glass, to the reflection of snowflakes caught in the dark outside. At 7:14 p.m., while conversation at the table swelled, the camera across the street began to hum again. Arthur had set it on a timer before leaving. A small modification had built himself, ensuring it would capture the hour between 715 and 815. Without his touch, the machine began its work, recording the Henderson home from afar. No one in the dining room knew they were being filmed. Later, this detail would trouble people. Some called it voyeuristic, others called it prophetic, and still others claimed it was something worse, that Arthur had always been waiting for a night like this. But on that Christmas Eve, no one thought twice. The duck was carved, wine glasses clinked, and children's laughter ran through the room. like ribbons of light outside the snow, fell heavier street lamps blurred at the edges, their halos growing thicker. The street looked like it belonged to another century. The few passing cars left soft arcs of light in the camera's lens. Before disappearing into the white, Arthur would later say he didn't remember much about the last half hour of that dinner, only that the air in the room seemed to still at moments, as though the house itself were listening. When pressed, head shake his head, eyes far away, and repeat some things you can't put into words. The camera will tell you more than I can. It would be years before anyone saw what that camera recorded, and by then the Hendersons would be long gone. 7:28 p.m. If you could have stood in the snow outside the Henderson house at that moment, the world would have felt almost too still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're interrupting something by just existing in it. Through the dining room window, the Henderson family sat gathered around a table that glowed like a hearth in the darkness. The golden light seemed to melt into the frost on the glass, blurring the edges of their movements. You could see Thomas lifting his fork, Mary leaning in to say something to Sophie, Peter rolling a pea across his plate as though negotiating with it, and sat nearest the window, her face lit softly from below by the candles, a strand of hair falling into her eyes. The snow outside thickened, wrapping the street in a kind of hush that made each sound, the creak of a chair, the faint clink of silverware, feel amplified somewhere down the block. A wind chime tinkled once and then stopped, as if silenced mid-song. At 7:32 p.m., Mrs. Foster excused herself from the table to fetch a pie from her car. She would later tell police. Shed paused halfway down the Hendersons' porch steps, turned back toward the window, and smiled at the sight. Sophie, trying to balance a spoon on her nose, while Peter cheered her on. They looked so alive, she would say in an interview, her voice catching on the word, like they were exactly where they were meant to be. By 7:38 p.m. the pie was on the sideboard, the conversation turning to the recent snowfall, heavier this year than most could remember. Thomas joked about needing to shovel the roof before morning. Laughter followed. But if you watch the surviving fragments of Arthur's 8mm film, you'll notice something peculiar. As the laughter fades, all 5 members of the Henderson family seem to glance almost imperceptibly toward the far corner of the dining room. The footage is grainy, the candlelight distorting the shadows, but the shift in their eyes is unmistakable. In the moment, no one said anything about it. At 7:41 p.m., Arthur raised his glass, though had declined wine. Earlier, Mary had poured him a half glass of sparkling cider, and now he lifted it in a small toast to good company on a good night. It was simple, almost formal, but it made Mary smile. The rest of the table followed suit, their glasses catching the light in brief star-like flashes that imaged the 5 Hendersons. 2 guests' hands lifted in a quiet moment of unity would be the last time they were ever seen together. 7:42 p.m. The moment passes, the glasses lower in the footage. Sophie is the first to set hers down, her small hand brushing the base of the candle. As she does, Thomas says something, and Mary turns her head toward him, the motion slow as though distracted by something else. The children lean in, listening. Peter's hand moves under the table, perhaps reaching for something dropped or for someone's hand. Then, in the far edge of the window's frame, a shadow moves. It's faint. It could be a trick of the candlelight or the passing of a car's headlights across the snow outside, but Arthur's camera captures it, a blot of darkness that doesn't match the rest of the scene. It slides along the wall and disappears. None of the guests react, or perhaps they do subtly. Mary's posture straightens and blinks twice in rapid succession, though Ma's jaw shifts as though clenching, and then the reel runs out. What happened between 7:42 and 7:45? The time Mrs. Foster says she last heard laughter has never been fully explained. Outside, the snow kept falling, smoothing over the tracks of the Foster's car, tires covering the path between the houses. Inside, the table still held the glow of the candles, the plates still full enough to suggest the meal wasn't over. But the next time the Hendersons were looked for, the chairs would be empty. That last sighting, 5 figures bathed in candlelight, frozen mid-dinner in the grainy film of a man across the street, has been described as beautiful and unbearable, in equal measure. Beautiful because it feels like a painting, the warmth, the togetherness, the perfection of the moment. Unbearable because of what followed, the kind of silence that swallows an entire house whole. In interviews years later, Mrs. Foster said something that never made it into the official transcripts. It was like they stepped out of the world all at once, like someone called them, and they just went. Whether that call came from a voice in the room, from the shadows, or from something no one else could see, no one has ever been able to answer. When the Henderson family failed to appear at church on Christmas morning, no one panicked. Not yet. Snow had been heavy overnight, and it wasn't unusual for families to spend the day indoors sealed in warmth, emerging only when the weather broke. But by the second day, when Thomas didn't show at the bank and Mary didn't return phone calls, neighbors began to knock on the Hendersons' door. No answer. The curtains were still drawn by December 28th. The police were involved. Officers moved through the house with quiet precision, searching each room, their breath visible in the still chilled air. They found nothing, no struggle, no overturned furniture, no missing coats. It was as though the family had risen from the table mid-dinner and simply walked away. It was that same day Arthur Bell walked across the street, his gloved hands holding a small cardboard box. He spoke in the same, even tone he always used, though the words themselves made the officer at the door still. "For a moment, I think you should see this," Arthur said. Inside the box was a single 8mm film reel, carefully wound, the label marked simply 12247-4. No note, no explanation. The reel was screened that evening in the police station's conference room, projected onto a portable white screen in a darkened corner. A handful of officers gathered, joined by the town's sheriff and one detective from the county. The film began with the faint sputter of the projector's bulb, the image blooming into focus, a wide static shot of Ashford Lane, snow falling gently, flakes tumbling in lazy spirals. For the first minute, it was almost idyllic. The Henderson house glowed in the center of the frame, its colored bulbs soft against the snow. A passerby trudged past, head bowed, leaving crisp tracks that filled quickly behind him. Through the dining room window shapes moved a man rising from his chair, a woman leaning over the table, the flicker of candlelight at 7:28 p.m., confirmed later by the timestamp on Arthur's camera notes. The view into the dining room became clearer. The camera, set at a distance, didn't offer faces in detail, but the outlines were unmistakable. The family was seated, joined by two guests. From time to time, someone would rise, a trip to the sideboard, a hand reaching for a bottle, a child leaning to whisper to another. The soundless footage forced the viewers in that dim police room to imagine the rest, the laughter, the scrape of chairs, the muted hum of conversation. And yet, as the minutes passed, something in the room at the station began to shift. Officers leaned forward, their brows furrowed. It was subtle, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. The Hendersons seemed distracted, not constantly, not overtly, but every so often one of them would glance toward the far corner of the room, the same one the camera couldn't quite capture, and did it first, then Thomas, then Mary. At 7:41 p.m., Arthur, just a silhouette in the footage, raised his glass. 7 others lifted theirs in turn, the frozen smile of a perfect Christmas moment. And then 7:42, the shadow, it slipped along the wall in a way no headlight could have. It moved too slowly, too deliberately, its edges not sharp, but soft, as though the light bent around it. The sheriff would later describe it as a stain in the air. The reaction in the room was slight, almost imperceptible, though. Ma's head tilting toward it, Mary's fingers curling tighter around her glass, Sophie's spoon slipping from her hand to clatter against her plate. Without sound, it felt like watching a conversation you couldn't hear, but desperately needed to understand. And then it was gone. The film continued for another 30 seconds, the family still seated, Arthur turning his head toward the window, as though sensing the cold outside. Then abruptly the dining chairs were empty, no movement, no rising from the table. One frame, they were there, the next gone. The sudden absence hit the viewers in the police station like a blow. Some muttered about film errors, frame skips, overexposure. But Arthur sat silently in the back of the room, eyes fixed on the screen, as if the film was confirming something he had known all along. The final 20 seconds of the reel showed nothing but the still-lit dining room candles burning low, the snow outside falling thicker. No one returned to the frame. When the lights came on, the room stayed silent for a long moment. Finally, the sheriff asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "Where was this camera?" "Upstairs," Arthur said simply. "Across the street. I set it before I went over." No one asked him why not that night. The reel was taken into evidence, stored in a climate-controlled cabinet at the county office. Copies were made for analysis, but the film itself never appeared on the evening news, never played for the public. Official reports referred to it only as neighbor-submitted visual material and concluded it was inconclusive regarding events inside the Henderson home. For years afterward, that footage existed in the strange limbo between evidence and legend. People who claimed to have seen it described the shadow in different ways. Some called it a trick of the light, others swore it moved with intent, but all agreed on the same point: whatever happened between 7:42 and 7:43 p.m., the film didn't just record it, it made you feel it. And in that feeling there was something worse than fear. There was certainty, the quiet, suffocating certainty that the Henderson family hadn't simply left, they'd been taken. The first person to step inside the Henderson home after that night was Officer Daniel Price. It was the morning of December 26th, 1974. The snow had stopped falling hours before leaving the neighborhood coated in a pale, unbroken crust, sunlight scattered weakly off the drifts, too cold to melt anything from the outside. The Henderson house looked unchanged, the colored bulbs still glowing faintly in the daylight, wreath still fixed to the door. It didn't look like the kind of place anyone could simply vanish from. Price knocked 3 times, calling out their names. No answer. He tried the handle, unlocked. That detail would stick with him more than anything else. People in Ashford Lane didn't leave doors unlocked in winter, not because of crime, but because of the cold. The moment he stepped in, the warmth he expected wasn't there. The air had the stale chill of a house left unattended for a day or two. He paused in the entryway, letting his eyes adjust. The faint scent of roast duck lingered, but beneath it, something else, not rot, not mildew, just an absence, like the air itself had been emptied of its usual weight. In the dining room, the table was still set, plates, half-filled glasses, still holding dark liquid. The candles, the same ones Arthur's footage had shown, had burned almost to the base, their wax curled into brittle spirals. One chair was pulled slightly farther from the table, as though someone had begun to stand. Another had a napkin folded neatly on the seat, untouched. Price's boots clicked against the hardwood as he moved from room to room. The kitchen counters were cluttered with the aftermath of cooking. Open jars, a dish towel balled beside the sink, a pot still on the stove. Upstairs, the children's rooms told their own story. A doll on Sophie's pillow, Peter's toy soldiers mid-battle on the floor, Anna's book lying open on her desk. Every detail pointed to interruption, not preparation. They hadn't left, they'd been stopped. What unnerved Price most was the sound, or lack of it. No ticking clock, no hum of a radio. The silence pressed in from all sides, the kind that makes you breathe differently, as though you might disturb it. By the time the other officers joined him, Price had already decided this was wrong, not just a case of a family stepping away unexpectedly. Something about the house felt staged, not by a person, but by the absence itself, like the rooms had been waiting to be found this way. The officers moved methodically. They checked closets, the basement, the attic. Every coat was accounted for, every pair of shoes still in place. The only thing missing besides the people was the sense of motion, that invisible current that lives in a home when it's occupied. Here, that current had been cut off cleanly. At 11:45 a.m., Chief Myers arrived. He was a heavy-set man with decades of experience, the type who didn't scare easily. But even he paused in the doorway of the dining room, looking at the plates, the candle stubs, the faint marks of chairs against the rug. This, he said quietly, isn't how families leave. Outside, neighbors had begun to gather on the street. Their boots crunched in the snow, voices low and uncertain. Words spread quickly, not of a crime, but of something stranger. Those who dared to step onto the porch said the moment you crossed the threshold, it felt like stepping into a place that hadn't been touched in years, not hours. Price emerged onto the porch, rubbing his hands together for warmth. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Graham, caught his eye. They're not coming back, are they? She asked. It wasn't a question, not really, more like the voicing of a truth she didn't want to carry alone. Inside, a camera technician began photographing the rooms. Each click of the shutter sounded like a hammer blow in the silence. When he developed the prints later, he would say the images were clear, crisp, even, but he didn't like looking at them for too long. The more you stared, the more you felt like the house was looking back. By evening, the Henderson home had been sealed. No one entered after dark. The curtains were left drawn, the lights switched off from the street. It became a silhouette, the memory of warmth replaced by a dark stillness. People walking home would cross to the opposite sidewalk rather than pass directly in front. The empty house didn't just hold the absence of the Henderson family, it amplified it. And for those who had been inside, it left an impression that would not fade, the sense that something else was still there waiting. The search began before dawn on December 27th. Police cars idled along Ashford Lane, their exhaust curling into the brittle morning air. Officers moved from door to door, speaking quietly with neighbors, jotting notes in small, weather-stiff notebooks. The Henderson home, now sealed, stood behind yellow tape that fluttered faintly in the wind. The official line was simple: the family could have left voluntarily. In theory, that was possible, but in practice, no one on Ashford Lane believed it. This wasn't the City, you didn't vanish without someone noticing, and the Hendersons especially weren't the kind of people to leave without a word. The first sweep focused on the obvious surrounding streets, open fields, the frozen pond. Near the park, volunteers from town joined in, their boots sinking into the snow with each slow step. They called the Hendersons names, their voices carrying thinly through the trees. Nothing answered, but the wind. By the second day, the search expanded to the woods east of town. Officers marked grids on paper maps, crossing them off as teams completed each section. Snowmobiles traced long curving paths through the drifts, their engines sounding like distant bees. In the otherwise quiet landscape, the frozen lake was dredged, a grim task. The divers emerged, shivering, shaking their heads. Nothing. One muttered, his breath fogging the air. Not even a dropped glove or a torn scrap of fabric. Back in the Henderson home, investigators combed every inch. Again, fingerprints were taken, though they yielded nothing beyond the family's own and those of the two guests. The Fosters' food samples from the plates were sent to the state lab, coming back without trace of poison or sedative. No forced entry, no missing belongings, not even a set of footprints leading away from the house. The snowfall on Christmas Eve had covered the ground too quickly for anything to be preserved. The lack of evidence didn't quiet suspicion. If anything, it sharpened it, and Arthur Bell found himself caught in that narrowing focus. Arthur had given the police his reel without hesitation, but the gesture raised as many questions as it answered. Why had he been filming the Hendersons that night? Why set the camera to run unattended? His explanation that he liked to record the street at Christmas felt too thin for some. The camera itself was seized for analysis, returned weeks later with no signs of tampering. Still, whispers began to spread. Some said Arthur's footage looked too deliberate, the framing too perfect. Others claimed had known the family better than he admitted. A few swore they'd seen him standing at his upstairs window on nights when the Hendersons weren't home, his camera aimed at the empty house. Arthur didn't defend himself. He answered questions when asked, then retreated into his silence. When reporters from Boston tried to knock on his door, he didn't open it. The official investigation continued into January. Detectives checked train stations, bus depots, nearby hotels. They sent out bulletins to surrounding counties, even neighboring states. Not a single confirmed sighting came back. Meanwhile, the town's mood shifted. In the first days, the absence felt temporary, like the Hendersons might appear at any moment with a story to tell. But as weeks passed, the hope began to sour. Children stopped sledding near the Henderson street. People lowered their voices when walking past the house. In the grocery store, conversations trailed off at the mention of their name. Chief Myers gave a statement to the press in early February. We have no reason to believe foul play was involved, he said, though his eyes betrayed no conviction. We will continue to follow every lead until we know exactly what happened. But there were no leads, only the real, and that grainy shadow. By spring, the search had dwindled. Funding was limited. The snow had melted, washing away what little trace there might have been. Officially, the Henderson case became a missing persons presumed voluntary departure file, a phrasing that satisfied no one. For the neighbors, the official ending felt like a refusal. They knew the Hendersons. They'd sat at their table, borrowed sugar from their pantry, held their children's hands. People like that didn't just walk away. And even if they had, why would they leave behind every possession, every coat, every shoe? In the dead of winter, in the years that followed, the case became less an investigation and more a wound the town learned to live around. But for those who'd joined the search, the images remained: the wide empty fields where their voices had gone unanswered, the frozen lake black beneath the ice, the dining room table still set for a meal that would never be finished. And in the quiet hours of night, when the streets of Ashford Lane were empty, a few claimed they could still see it, the shadow on the wall, and Arthur Bell's film moving with a patience that suggested it wasn't finished. By the summer of 1975, the official search was over. The Hendersons' file sat in the county archives, sealed and labeled, but not forgotten. In Ashford Lane, forgetting was impossible. Every time someone passed the white clapboard house with the green shutters, they felt the same pull, a mix of curiosity and dread, as if the house itself was watching. And so the absence began to fill itself, not with evidence, but with stories. It started small, a comment made at the grocer's counter, a whispered theory over coffee. One neighbor would lean into another and say, "You know, I heard Thomas was in trouble at the bank," or "Mary had family out west, maybe they left to start over." But as months passed, those practical explanations dried up. No debt collector had come calling, no distant cousin claimed to have seen them. The Hendersons simply stayed gone. That's when the theories began to shift away from the plausible and into the strange. Some said it was a cult, that someone had come to dinner that night with more then a pie and a bottle of wine. That the shadow in Arthur's footage wasn't a trick of the candlelight, but a robed figure who spoke in a language no one could understand. In this telling, the family had been taken willingly drawn in, as one elderly neighbor put it, her voice dropping on the words. Others preferred the theory of an accident covered up, a faulty furnace perhaps, or a carbon monoxide leak. But even that had its problems. Why would a leak leave the table undisturbed, and who would have taken the bodies? The story twisted itself into knots, but there was a third kind of rumor, the one that spread most quietly and lingered the longest. It began with the children. A boy from the next street over claimed that on Christmas Eve had seen Sophie standing in her upstairs window, not just standing, waving, though not at him. Her eyes, he said, weren't focused on the street, but on something lower, as if someone were standing directly below her window. Someone the boy couldn't see. Then there was the matter of the upstairs curtain in the Hendersons' house. Mrs. Graham, who lived across the street, swore that for weeks after the disappearance, she'd see it move just slightly on still nights, not a sway, but the slow, deliberate parting of fabric, as though a hand were pulling it back. When she mentioned it in passing to the Postwicks, they nodded gravely. We've seen it too, Mr. Postwick said, but only when the moon's out. By autumn, the house had taken on a presence of its own. Teenagers dared each other to walk up the porch steps after dark. They'd come back, pale, muttering about a sound inside, a faint ticking like a metronome. In another room, no one ever found the source. And Arthur Bell, he became both a central figure and a ghost in his own right. People argued over his role in the story. Some insisted had been the last friendly face the Hendersons had seen, and that he was just as much a victim haunted by what had witnessed. Others were certain had known more than had told. Arthur, for his part, withdrew further. He stopped answering his door, stopped attending even the smallest of town gatherings. Those who caught glimpses of him on his porch said he looked thinner, as though whatever had happened across the street had pulled something out of him too. He kept the upstairs window, the one facing the Hendersons' dining room, covered from that year on. It was during this time that the most unsettling rumor surfaced, one that no one could trace to a single source, as if it had been whispered into existence. All at once the story went like this. On the night of December 24th, Arthur's camera had not been the only one recording. Somewhere, someone else, perhaps another neighbor, perhaps a stranger, had been filming from the opposite direction, capturing the back of the Henderson home. And in that unseen reel, the last frames didn't show the family at the table at all, but a single chair slowly turning toward the kitchen on its own. No one ever produced such a film, but in Ashford Lane, absence had always been the best fertilizer for belief. By the turn of the decade, the Hendersons' disappearance had left the realm of police work entirely. It became a fireside tale, a way to frighten visiting relatives, a whispered warning to children about keeping your curtains shut at night. The shadow in Arthur's film became a shapeshifter in the telling, sometimes a figure in a coat, sometimes an animal, sometimes nothing but a formless dark that made the room feel smaller. The house remained empty. No for sale sign ever appeared on the lawn. The county claimed it had fallen into legal limbo, ownership unresolved. The yard grew wild in the summers, the snow lay undisturbed in the winters, and always the dining room remained exactly as it had been left. Plates, glasses, candlesticks, a paused frame. No one dared to restart. Some nights, walking home, you could almost convince yourself you saw movement inside, a silhouette in the dining room, the faintest flicker of light. But it was the kind of thing you didn't stop to examine. In Ashford Lane, you learned to keep walking, because if you looked too long you might see what Arthur Bell had, and then you'd never stop seeing it. It was the winter of 1999 when Arthur Bell's name returned to the whispers on Ashford Lane. By then, the Henderson disappearance was 25 years old. A story most people had learned to live around. The house still stood uninhabited, the paint peeling in strips along the siding, its windows staring out like half-flitted eyes. Children who hadn't even been born in 1974 crossed the street when they passed it because their parents told them to. Arthur, now 72, still lived in his own home across the street, but time had whittled him down. His frame was more fragile, his voice thinner, though he remained just as private. It was only after a mild stroke left him bedridden that the wall had kept between himself and the rest of the world began to crack. It started with a phone call to Michael Hayes, a local journalist who'd been covering small-town oddities for years. Hayes had interviewed Arthur once in the mid-80s about the Henderson case. Arthur had given short, clipped answers, then never looking Hayes in the eye. Now his voice on the phone was different, hesitant, almost apologetic. "I've got something I should have shown them," Arthur said. "Something I didn't." When Hayes arrived the next day, the house was dim, and cold the curtains were drawn the air, faintly metallic, as though the heater hadn't been on in days. Arthur lay propped up in bed, his breathing shallow, but steady. On the nightstand sat a small, dented metal box, its surface scratched and dull with age. I kept it, Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper, not because I wanted to, but because I wasn't ready to let it go. Hayes sat beside the bed, switching on a recorder. Kept what? Arthur's eyes moved to the box, the second reel. The words hung in the air like frost. For a moment, Hayes thought had misheard. You mean there was more than one? Arthur gave a slow nod. I didn't turn it in, not in 74. I told myself they wouldn't believe it, told myself they'd say I'd tampered with it, but the truth is, he broke off, his hand tightening around the blanket. The truth is, I didn't want them to see it. I didn't want anyone to. When Hayes asked why, Arthur's gaze drifted toward the window, the same one from which his camera had once watched the Hendersons' dining room. Because the first reel showed what happened, the second showed what came after. He didn't explain right away. Instead, he talked about the days following the disappearance, how the police had questioned him, searched his house, taken the camera. They thought that was all I had, but I'd swapped the reel. Before they came, the second one was in the darkroom. I locked it up and told myself I'd destroy it. Never did. Hayes asked what was on it. Arthur's voice lowered, forcing Hayes to lean closer. After the first reel ran out, the timer reset. There was enough light from the street lamps to keep filming. You can see the dining room empty, but the candles are still burning, just barely. Then something moves. He paused, his eyes glassy. Not quite here. It's not a person. It's the space itself, like the room folds just for a second. The tablecloth lifts, though there's no wind. The shadows in the corner pull toward each other until there's just one, and then his voice caught his throat, working, and then it turns. Hayes asked. Arthur's eyes locked onto his, like it noticed the camera. The silence after that felt heavier than the words. Hayes' fingers hovered over his recorder, as if afraid the machine itself might capture something it shouldn't. Arthur reached toward the nightstand. With a trembling hand, Hayes helped him lift the metal box, its latch stiff with age inside. Wrapped in yellowed tissue was the second 8mm reel. The label was written in the same precise, slanted handwriting as the first 122474. Or two. I can't carry it anymore, Arthur said. It's yours now, but when you see it, his voice faltered, when you see it, you'll understand why I stayed quiet. Hayes asked if Arthur wanted to be there when it was played. A faint shake of the head. No, I've seen it enough times in my head. 2 days later, Arthur Bell died in his sleep. The official cause was listed as complications from the stroke, but among the few who knew about the reel, there was a quiet belief that his heart had simply decided it had carried enough. Hayes kept the metal box untouched for a week, debating whether to open it alone or bring it to the police. In the end, curiosity and something deeper, a sense of responsibility, won. He set up an old 8mm projector in his office, threading the film through with careful hands. Before he switched on the machine, he closed the blinds. The hum of the projector filled the small office like the sound of a living thing. Michael Hayes sat alone, leaning forward in his chair, the metal box now open on the desk. Beside him, the second reel spun slowly. As the first frames flickered onto the pull-down screen, it began almost exactly where the first reel had ended. The Henderson dining room viewed from across Ashford Lane through Arthur Bell's upstairs window. The table was empty now. No family, no guests, but the candles still burned low there. Flames unsteady, without the warm movement of bodies. The room looked colder, the air inside heavier somehow. At first, Hayes thought it was nothing more than an eerie postscript, the visual equivalent of an empty stage after a play's final act. He could almost hear Arthur's voice in his head telling him it was what came after, though he wasn't sure yet what that meant. The footage lingered on the still room for nearly a full minute. The camera, locked in place, didn't waver. Outside, snow continued to fall, the flakes drifting lazily in the pale light from the street lamps. Inside, the scene was unmoving until it wasn't. At 27 seconds, and something on the table shifted. It was subtle, so subtle that Hayes thought at first it was just his eyes adjusting to the flicker of the candles. But no, the tablecloth had moved just slightly, as though someone had brushed against it. Hayes leaned forward, squinting, but there was no visible hand, no body, nothing to account for the disturbance. The film grain made the shadows restless. He told himself that was all. It was shadows playing tricks. But then the candles wavered, their flames pulling sideways toward the far corner of the room. That corner had been dark in the first reel, but here in the second, the darkness seemed deeper, thicker, like a pool of ink that refused to reflect light. And from within that blackness, the shadows began to slide together, merging into a single shape. It didn't walk. It didn't even sway. It simply grew, as though drawing itself up from the floor. Hayes felt his breath catch, not from what he was seeing, but from a feeling in his chest, an almost physical awareness that whatever this was, it was aware of him. The shape didn't have edges in the way a person's body would. It was indistinct, more like a distortion, as though someone had cut a hole in the film itself and let something from somewhere else bleed through, and then slowly, too slowly, it turned. It didn't have a face, but Hayes could feel it. Looking, the tilt, the pause, the stillness. Afterward, it was the posture of something studying you, measuring you, even through decades-old film, even without sound. The weight of its attention was unmistakable. Hayes' hands itched to stop the reel. Every instinct told him to turn away, but he didn't. He watched as the shape began to move toward the table, each step or what passed for a step seeming to draw the shadows along the walls toward it, like ink running toward a spill. The candles flickered violently, now bending toward the thing as though gravity itself had shifted. Hayes realized had been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, afraid even that sound might be too loud. Then, without warning, the camera caught something else, the faintest suggestion of movement, just outside the dining room doorway. A hand, small, barely visible. It was there, and gone in a single frame, but Hayes' stomach tightened. The proportions were wrong for an adult. The shadow reached the table, and then the tablecloth lifted higher, this time, as though invisible hands were peeling it back. Hayes thought he saw the edge of a plate slide, then tip, though it didn't fall. The movement was deliberate, controlled. At the 1 minute mark, the distortion leaned, if that's what it was doing, toward the camera's point of view. The screen rippled faintly, like heat over asphalt, and Hayes could swear the grain of the film shifted color for a moment, darkening, and then almost imperceptibly the distortion stilled, as if listening. The next 30 seconds were agonizing. The shape did not move, but the longer Hayes watched, the more certain he became that it wasn't looking at the room anymore. It was looking at Arthur's camera, and by extension now at him. The flicker of the projector seemed too loud in the room. Hayes' eyes watered, but he didn't blink. He couldn't. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the shape began to unravel, not fade, unravel. Pieces of it pulled away, as though the air itself were dismantling it, tugging it back into the dark corner. Within moments, the room was empty again. The shadows flat, the candles guttering out one by one. The final frames of the reel were pure stillness. The dining room, lit only by the cold wash of the street lamps outside. No movement, no sound. Hayes let the projector run until the reel flapped loose at the end. Then he sat in the half-dark, staring at the blank screen, the afterimage of that shifting shadow still imprinted in his mind. He understood now why Arthur had kept it, not out of malice, not even entirely out of fear, but because there was no way to explain it. That wouldn't sound insane. It wasn't evidence in the way police understood the word. It was a warning. Hayes rewound the reel, carefully slid it back into the metal box, and locked the latch. He didn't watch it again that night. And yet when he turned off the lights in his office, he hesitated before stepping outside. Through the glass of his window, the street beyond was empty, the snow falling in thin silver lines. But for a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw something. In the reflection, a shape standing in the corner behind him, watching. Michael Hayes didn't release the second reel right away. For weeks it sat locked in his desk drawer, the metal box catching the light like something alive. Whenever he passed by, he told himself he was waiting for the right time, the right way to show it. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want to be the one responsible for what would follow. When he finally did share it, it wasn't with the police. It was with a small trusted circle, a retired detective who had worked the original case, a local historian, and a film restoration expert from Boston. They met in the back room of the town library one winter evening, the projector set up against a bare wall. The reaction was exactly what Hayes feared. The detective sat through the entire reel without speaking, his eyes narrowing only at the moment the distortion turned toward the camera. When it ended, he exhaled sharply, rubbed his jaw, and said, "If I was still wearing a badge, I'd call this nothing but light interference, but I'm not wearing one anymore, and I don't think that's what this is." The historian said nothing for a long time, then muttered something about architectural cold spots and rooms that aren't built for just people. The film expert was the only one to attempt a technical breakdown. "It's unaltered," she said, scrolling through frame-by-frame scans. "The grains consistent, no splice marks. Whatever's on here, it was in the room when this was filmed, and that's how the second reel began its second life, not as police evidence, but as something stranger. Word leaked, as it always does. By spring, half the town had heard about it. By summer, it had spread beyond Ashford Lane entirely. A regional magazine ran a short feature, The Henderson Vanishing, New Evidence or Elaborate Hoax, and the internet picked it up. Soon the footage was in the hands of online communities devoted to everything from cold cases to paranormal research. Skeptics called it nothing more than an old film artifact. "You people are seeing a ghost because you want to see one commenter wrote that's just bad lighting, dust on the lens, maybe even a curtain moving from a draft. Others suggested Arthur had faked it, perhaps using double exposure, though no one could explain why he would sit on such a hoax for decades without gaining a single cent from it. Believers, on the other hand, tore apart every frame like scripture. They slowed the footage to a crawl, outlined the shadow's shape, even claimed to detect faint secondary movements as if there were more than one presence in the room. The single-frame glimpse of the small hand outside the dining room doorway became an obsession. Some said it was Sophie's hand, others swore the proportions were wrong for any of the Henderson children, but the most disturbing interpretations came from those who fixated on the turning the moment the shadow seemed to notice the camera. A few insisted they saw the grain of the film distort outward, as though the lens itself had been touched. One particularly unnerving theory suggested the shadow hadn't just looked at the camera, but threw it into Arthur's upstairs room. And perhaps beyond, Hayes avoided most of the debates. He didn't post online, didn't grant interviews, and turned down 3 documentary crews who came knocking, but privately the real was changing him. He found himself glancing at corners, more often avoiding his own reflection in darkened windows at night. In quiet moments, he'd replay the distortion stillness in his mind, the sense that it was listening. In Ashford Lane, the second reel reawakened old fears the Henderson house already avoided, became something closer to a local taboo. Teenagers still dared each other to approach, but none crossed the threshold. A few even claimed the upstairs curtain, the one Mrs. Graham had seen moved decades earlier, had begun to twitch again, though no wind was blowing. The Fosters, the last people to share a meal with the Hendersons, refused to comment publicly. In private, Mr. Foster told a friend, "If that thing on the film was in the room that night, then we were never alone." Not for a second, the friend said. He looked pale when he said it, like someone who'd just realized how close they'd come to something they didn't understand. The divide between skeptics and believers never closed. If anything, it deepened, and the gap was filled with theories stranger than either side could tolerate. A Boston Paranormal Society claimed the shadow was a dimensional fold, the physical manifestation of space warping inward. An amateur physicist from Maine argued that it was time collapsed, the brief overlay of 2 moments, one with the family, one without. Others leaned on folklore, pointing out that in some New England ghost stories, houses took their residents when certain conditions were met. But there was one theory that Hayes refused to speak about publicly. It came from a woman in her 70s who knocked on his door late one autumn evening. She introduced herself only as Margaret and said she'd grown up 2 towns over. "I've seen something like it before," she told him. "Different house, different family, but the same feeling." She wouldn't elaborate much beyond that, except to say that those houses aren't empty after they're just waiting. When Hayes asked what they were waiting for, she smiled faintly and said another dinner. Hayes never saw her again. By the turn of the millennium, the second reel had settled into the same strange space as the first, somewhere between evidence and legend, a thing that both clarified and deepened the mystery it hadn't solved. The disappearance, if anything, it had made the question of what happened to the Hendersons even less answerable, and for Hayes that was the most haunting truth of all. Had started with a story about a family who vanished, but somewhere along the way it had become a story about something else, something that didn't just take people, but left behind a silence that never stopped watching. The Henderson house still stands on Ashford Lane. Nearly 50 years have passed since Christmas Eve 1974, but from the street, it looks almost untouched, as though time itself skirted around it, unwilling to get too close. The white clapboard is weathered, but intact, the green shutters still hanging straight, their paint flaked just enough to suggest long neglect. The colored bulbs that once bled warmth into the snow are gone, their wires coiled somewhere in a forgotten drawer, but the porch still bears the faint outline where they once hung. The yard is wild now, especially in summer. Ivy climbs the porch posts like slow green fire, and the grass grows in uneven tufts, as if the ground itself refuses to settle. In winter, the snow lays a smooth, deceptive skin over everything, and from the sidewalk you'd swear it could still be 1974 inside. Most people don't linger out front, even those who claim not to believe in anything beyond the ordinary cross to the far sidewalk. When they pass, it's not fear exactly, more like the instinct you feel when walking past a sleeping animal you can't quite identify. Michael Hayes walks up the porch steps on a gray afternoon in late December. The air smells like snow, even though the forecast says it won't fall until nightfall. He carries a small camera bag, though he hasn't decided yet if he'll actually use it. The front door is unlocked. It always has been inside. The cold hits immediately, not the sharp bite of winter air, but the deeper cold of a place long uninhabited. It clings to the skin, seeps into your clothes. Hayes pauses in the entryway, his breath a pale cloud. The smell is faint, but distinct, old wood dust, and something metallic, like coins left too long in a drawer. The layout is exactly as it was described in police reports. To the left, the living room; straight ahead, the dining room; beyond it, the kitchen, its counters just visible from here. The floor creaks underfoot, the sound carrying strangely in the empty air. Hayes steps into the dining room, and for a moment the air feels heavier, not colder exactly, but thicker. The table is still set. The plates are dusty now, their patterns dulled by decades of neglect, but the arrangement hasn't changed. Glasses sit where they were left, one with a faint dark ring at the bottom. Where liquid once was, the candlesticks lean slightly, their wax frozen mid-drip, like slow rivers caught in place. He circles the table slowly, as though afraid to disturb it. In one chair, the one slightly pulled back in Arthur's film, the napkin is still folded untouched. He can't help imagining the moment after the first reel ended, the sudden absence, the untouched plates, the impossible stillness. From the corner of his eye, Hayes catches a faint movement, and he stops. It's nothing, just the shifting of light from the bare window above the sideboard, but it makes his chest tighten anyway. He thinks about Margaret's words from years ago. They're just waiting for another dinner upstairs. The air is even colder. The children's rooms are exactly as they were found. Sophie's doll still sits on her pillow, its glass eyes slightly clouded. Peter's army men remain in formation, some toppled over in what could be play or retreat. Anna's book lies open on her desk, its pages yellowed, but still legible. The sentence on the left page ends mid-thought, as though she'd been interrupted and meant to return. In the master bedroom, dust lies thick enough to mute every step. The closet door is open, revealing neat rows of clothes, wool coats, pressed dresses still hanging. Hayes touches one sleeve and finds it brittle under his fingers. Finally, he steps into the upstairs front room, Arthur's old vantage point. The curtains here are thin, nearly transparent, and through them he can see the Henderson house's dining room window perfectly. He tries to imagine Arthur standing here in the dark, his camera fixed on that exact spot, the lens capturing everything while the rest of the street slept. The room smells faintly of old film, though that might be his imagination. For a long moment, Hayes simply stands there, his hands resting on the sill, eyes locked on the dining room window across the street. Then something shifts. It's subtle at first, a change in the quality of the light, the way shadows seem to pull toward the corner of the dining room. Hayes blinks, thinking it's just his own mind superimposing the second reel onto reality, but the longer he looks, the more certain he becomes that the corner is darker than it should be. Not black, just thicker. He feels that old pressure in his chest again, the same one from the night he first watched the second reel. A quiet, patient attention. Hayes forces himself to step back. He reminds himself that this is why people avoid this house, not because they've all seen something, but because enough of them have. Downstairs, the dining room looks exactly as it did when he arrived, and yet as he passes through, one of the glasses catches his eye. It's no longer perfectly still. The liquid ring inside has smeared slightly, as though the glass had been moved, just enough to notice, not enough to explain. He doesn't touch it. Outside, the air feels warmer, though it's still winter cold. Hayes walks down the porch steps and back toward the street. The Henderson house sits quiet behind him, its windows pale in the gray afternoon. He doesn't look back, not because he's afraid of what he might see, but because he's afraid of what he might not. At the corner of Ashford Lane, he glances up toward Arthur's old house. The upstairs curtain is still thin, still drawn back, just enough to see the dining room window. For a moment, he swears he sees movement there, not in the Henderson house, but in Arthur's window itself, a figure still watching. But when he blinks, it's gone. The snow starts to fall as he reaches his car, slow, lazy flakes like the night it all began. Hayes sits for a moment before starting the engine, staring through the windshield at the quiet street. Somewhere behind those closed curtains, a table is still set, plates still waiting, candles burned to stubs, and if you stand on that porch in the silence for long enough, you might feel it too, that slow, patient watching, that almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the house is holding its breath, waiting for the next knock at the door.